Is Pete Ricketts going to be the next U.S. Senator from Nebraska? Today on Political Access, we're going to cover this story, and we're also going to take a look at former governors over the past 10 years that have tried to run for the U.S. Senate and see if they had any success. So first off, a little bit of background about this story. Ben Sasse is the Republican senator from Nebraska. He was reelected in 2020. He will be stepping down to serve as the president of the University of Florida. And there will be a special election in 2 years for his seat. And then, of course, the regular election will be 2 years after that, 2026. But in the interim, the governor of Nebraska will get to appoint a replacement. The current governor is Pete Ricketts, but he is term limited out, and he's about to leave office. And he has said he would like the next governor, which is Jim Pillen, to appoint the replacement. That's all fair enough, except Pete Ricketts, the outgoing governor, has decided he wants to be that replacement. And even Don Bacon says he expects Ricketts will be selected as the replacement. So you could take this any number of ways, but I do view it as kind of sleazy to act like you're going to let your successor fill the seat, but then right after that you say you want to be the one to fill it? Yeah, that just seems kind of self-serving to me, and I'm sure a lot of people are not going to like that. But I do wish the special election was going to be next year instead of in 2 years, but we could take a look at the Wikipedia page for that special election. And right now there's two names here that are declared candidates for that appointment. Pete Ricketts is the main candidate, and then there's a whole bunch of potential candidates here. I would think Nebraska would want somebody other than Pete Ricketts, in my opinion. I think they might be a little bit tired of him. When Pete Ricketts first ran for governor in 2014, he barely squeaked out a win in that primary. He only got a little bit over 26% of the vote. So that narrow win there propelled him in the general election. Then he won re-election, and now he's trying to move on to the Senate. So that got me thinking, what about other governors that have tried to make the transition to the U.S. Senate? Well, you could go back pretty far on this, but I decided to just take a look at the last 10 years, back to 2012. And I will be leaving out senators that already did serve as governor, but they made that transition before 2012. Some of those names are Gene Shaheen in New Hampshire, John Hoeven in North Dakota, and even Joe Manchin in West Virginia. He served as governor prior to 2010. 2010, he got into the Senate. So we're only going to go back to 2012. And let's start actually in Hawaii. Hawaii is a very blue state, and they have had only one Republican governor since the very first governor, and that is Linda Lingle. She won 2 terms, the second of which was in that blue wave of 2006. She got over 62% of the vote. So that does completely defy what we would think about traditional Hawaii politics. So Lingle was popular. She left office 2010. She tried to go to the Senate 2 years later, and she flopped hard. She got 37% of the vote, lost to Mazie Hirono, and this was a very unsuccessful transition from governor to Senate. I think it was a long shot for Lingle, though, and she probably knew that as well, given Hawaii is definitely a blue state, especially on a federal level. Next, let's actually go back to 2012 in Nebraska again. Bob Kerrey, the Democrat, he served as governor from 1983 to 1987, and he actually already was a U.S. Senator from 1989 to 2001. That was back when Nebraska did tend to elect more moderate Democrats, so he tried to make a comeback in 2012. He had all that name recognition, but he still lost big time. He got 42% of the vote. He lost to Deb Fischer. So this is another completely unsuccessful transition, but technically in this case, he already was in the Senate, so this is more of an unsuccessful comeback. Next, also in 2012, in Virginia, Democrat Tim Kaine, he served as governor from 2006 to 2010. A few years later, he tried to make a bid for the Senate, and he was successful. He won with 52.8% of the vote, defeating incumbent and former governor George Allen. So that was a closer race, but still, final result shows it wasn't really all that close, and it does go to show you can have some success trying to seek the Senate after already serving as governor. Next, also from 2012, that was a big year for governors trying to make comebacks. This time in Wisconsin, former Republican Governor Tommy Thompson, who served as the governor for a long time. He was very popular from 1987 to 2001. So he's basically the Wisconsin legend, tons of name recognition. But even considering all that, this was a comeback after he'd already been out of office for a while. This was an open seat. Republicans did actually have a competitive primary. Even though Thompson had everything going for him on his resume, he still only won that primary with 34% of the vote. And he went on to lose to Tammy Baldwin, who did not have any kind of competitive primary. He got 46% of the vote to Tammy Baldwin's 51.4. And if we look at the polling for this race, early on in the campaign season, it showed Thompson leading most of these polls, but by the end, he ended up trailing, and he took the only loss of his political career. Next, let's go up to 2016 and take a look at Indiana, where Democrat Evan Bayh, who served as governor from 1989 to 1997, and U.S. Senator from 1999 to 2011. Just like Bob Kerrey, he tried to make a comeback. Again, Bayh was popular when he was in office, but it was a different political era at that point, and he didn't even win the primary. The actual winner of that Democratic primary, Barron Hill, he stepped down once it became clear Bayh was going to jump into the race. So it made sense for this kind of a move in this increasingly red state. Pick a well-known popular former governor and former senator, and that's probably going to give you your best chance. Well, the polling did show Bayh with a lead in all these early polls. He had kind of a commanding lead in some of them, but just like with Tommy Thompson, by the time election day rolled around, Evan Bayh was trailing pretty bad, and Bayh lost. He got 42% of the vote. Todd Young won with 52%. So this example, along with the Nebraska example, again, they're a little bit in a separate category because they did already make the successful transition from governor to Senate, but they were totally unsuccessful for a comeback in that Senate bid. Next up, 2016 again, this time in New Hampshire. Democrat Maggie Hassan was governor from 2013 to 2017. And while she was still in office for governor, she ran for the U.S. Senate, and this was an extremely close race. She did narrowly defeat incumbent Republican Kelly Ayotte by about 1,000 votes. She got 47.98% of the vote. So this was a successful transition. Let's move on to, again, 2016, this time in Ohio. And we have former Governor Ted Strickland, who served from 2007 to 2011. He was defeated in his re-election bid for governor, but after a few years out of office, the state has shifted toward the right. Democrats figured, why not go for the former Democratic governor? So he won the primary, but in the general election, he lost by a landslide. He only got 37% of the vote. And if we go down to the polling here, this is another time where the early polls actually favored the person who ended up losing. This time Strickland, he was leading in a lot of these polls. But by election day, they did show Rob Portman with a heavy lead, and of course, Portman won by a ton. Next, let's go on to 2018 and take a look at Florida. This is similar to New Hampshire, where incumbent Republican Governor Rick Scott decided to run for the Senate while he was still in office. He was term limited out, so he decided to try to make a transition to the Senate. That was a brutal race. He faced off against longtime incumbent Democrat Bill Nelson. Florida is a tough state to win in, but Rick Scott successfully defeated Bill Nelson. It's a very narrow margin. Scott only got just over 50% of the vote. And of course, since then, Florida has drifted much more to the right. And let's move on to 2018 in Tennessee. This had Democrat Phil Bredesen, who was the governor of Tennessee from 2003 to 11. He tried to make a Senate bid here, and similar to some of these other states like Indiana, the state has shifted a lot toward the right. This was all the Democrats could come up with, was a former Democratic governor. He did win that primary, but in the general election, Bredesen lost by over 10 points. He got almost 44% of the vote. If we take a look at these polls, there's almost a pattern here where former governors, especially from the opposite party of the political trends, they start off strong in the polling. Bredesen here, he was leading in a lot of these polls and made Republicans nervous. They thought they were going to maybe lose a seat in Tennessee. They did generally flip toward Marsha Blackburn by Election Day. A couple of them were still kind of close, so Republicans were still a little bit uneasy, but in the end, they had nothing to worry about. Blackburn won by double digits. And finally, the last state here is going to be Montana from 2020, where Democrat Steve Bullock, he was the governor 2013 to 21. He was in office campaigning to move on to the Senate. He was a popular governor. Final result, he lost by 10. Steve Daines won with 55% of the vote. We go down and take a look at the polling. There's a back and forth race. Even right up to Election Day, Republicans were extremely nervous that they could narrowly lose this seat. And, of course, it did not pan out whatsoever. Bullock lost handily. So what does all this tell us? Well, I think it's completely a mixed bag. There are some instances of success where a popular former governor can come out of retirement and move on to the U.S. Senate, like Tim Kaine in Virginia. Other times it is possible to be in office as governor and still run for that Senate and have a little bit of success. It's happened a couple of times. But the majority of these cases are unsuccessful. And usually these transition attempts or these comeback attempts result in a blowout loss. A lot of times they start off strong in the polling because they obviously have star power in that state. But politics change, and Senate is not the same office as governor. And by the time Election Day rolls around, the gaps are actually surprisingly large in most of these cases. Even in this most recent example, Steve Bullock, I didn't think he was going to lose by 10. And he was certainly their best chance to win that seat. It was almost another Republican meltdown, but it wasn't. And in the case of Montana, Republicans will have another chance to melt down again in 2 years, facing off against John Tester again. But anyway, going from Pete Ricketts trying to find a roundabout way to appoint himself to the U.S. Senate, all the way to popular governors trying to go to the U.S. Senate and most of the time flopping hard, I found this to be interesting. Again, you could go back a little bit further and find other examples, but this is what I wanted to bring attention to. Let me know in the comments, what do you think about Pete Ricketts in Nebraska, and what do you think about any of these other races? Which ones were you most surprised about? Let me know down below. And if you enjoyed this channel on your way out, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next video.